Thank you, Insura. Good morning, everybody. I am sure if you came early in rush hour, you may have encountered a little bit of traffic congestion. We are fortunate this time the kids are not in school and therefore it is easier. But if you've been in this city over the last 4 weeks, then I am sure you have experienced what we commonly call doomso. And when we say doomso, I'm talking about the flip-flopping that we see in our power supplies. Indeed, if you have to travel into the country, sometimes you have to travel on roads that are not too comfortable to travel on. If you have had to go to our hospitals, sometimes you think that the service you receive is not the best possible that you can get. Sometimes we complain about the educational system. We complain about traffic congestion on the motorway. We keep complaining. This is not a condition of Ghana alone. It is something that we see the world over. It is a problem that confronts all people. People have had to think about how to solve this problem, and many options have been considered by different peoples around the world. Among them is what we are talking about today, the PPP alternative. And my assignment here is just to be here for 30 minutes to 45 minutes and explain what it is. Now, you must understand that this session is a little bit different from the first one we had. This time, you get a chance to ask questions. This time, you get a chance to express your opinion and your views if you think otherwise. In doing my work, I'll be looking at just two trends in our economy. And after looking at the trends, we will get to grips with the reasons why our government wants to do PPPs. Then I would actually talk about the PPP alternative. And then we will look at the national policy that the three speakers who spoke earlier this morning talked about. And then I'll take you briefly through the process of preparing a PPP project. Because it is our expectation that when we have left here, we will keep thinking about PPPs, we'll keep thinking about how to solve the problems that confront us in our districts, in our ministries, and in our country. And as we are saying and we are suggesting, PPP offers a very good opportunity to all of us. Now, let's take a look at this graph here. Very simple bars representing things which have happened in our country. Infrastructure investment per capita. In 2004, this is how much we spent per individual living in our country. 230,000 Ghana cedis per citizen. What this graph is saying is, what we spent in 2005 was smaller than what we spent in 2004. That is not all we see. Let's look at the number for 2006. It is yet smaller than what we spent in 2005. The graph continues to say that what we spent in 2007 is even smaller than what we spent in 2006. And as you see, it keeps dropping. In 2013, we spent about 60% of what we did in 2004. Listen, this kind of trend you may find about some other countries. And you don't worry when the infrastructure systems in those countries are mature. Here we are in Ghana, confronted with the problems that I talked about, roads that are not very good, health systems that we wish could be better, educational systems that we want to improve, and all manner of things. And this is the trend we see. When this is the trend you see in your country, then you must worry. Because you are making money, so to speak, yet you are forgetting about the assets that you must create to provide the services that the citizenry requires. Infrastructure spend per capita is dropping. One of the reasons is because our population is increasing. Yes, we are still generating revenues, and when you go to IRS, they will tell you that the number is always going up. But the fact is that we no longer have enough money to build the infrastructure assets we need. And that is a challenge that we must be thinking about. Let's look at a second graph. This is another graph about our country. Again, it is from 2004 to 2013. The other time, there was some kind of argument in Parliament. People were saying that Ghana has reached a certain percentage in terms of how much we have borrowed as relative to our GDP, etc., and that our debt is an unsustainable path. We are increasingly borrowing more money. And because we have to service those debts and make other payments, we see that it is growing. Again, what this one is telling us is that we are borrowing more and more, yet we cannot find the resources to build the infrastructure assets that we need, to build the schools that we desire, to build the hospitals that we would have to go to when we are taken ill, to build the roads that we must travel on, to build the airports that we must travel from and travel to. What this, married to the other graph, tells me is that the space for borrowing money is getting smaller and smaller for our country. And therefore, when the government talks about the private sector, you are beginning to get an idea. It is not that we are not working, but we must do things differently if we want to stem the trends that we see. If we continue to do things the way we've been doing them, the trends we see would continue. And ultimately, we will have major difficulties on our hands. Let's look at the same graphs in different ways. Now, it has been estimated that as a country, we require $1.5 billion per annum to build infrastructure assets if we are to move from where we are now to the level of our peers in sub-Saharan Africa. We are looking at countries like Mauritius. We are talking about countries like probably Angola. We are talking about Kenya, and we are talking about South Africa, etc. We are not saying exceeding what they have done, but just to do as much as they have done, we need $1.5 billion per annum. We are not spending that at the moment. So increasingly, we are falling behind. If we want to catch up, we have to invest this much over the next 10 years. But it has also been estimated that if we would improve upon the efficiencies at which we deliver services to ourselves, we can save $1.05 billion per annum. This is also something you must be thinking about. That if we can only change the ways we do things with the resources we already have and do those things better, we can get this much money for ourselves because we will save that much and use it on other things in the country. The result, therefore, is that if we consider other factors, then we require just about $400 million more per annum to come to the level of South Africa or to the level of Mauritius. But that is if we will be that efficient. So two issues arise. We must get more money, and we must be more efficient in the application of the meager resources that we have if we have to develop our country. And that is the challenge that confronts us as a people. This challenge has been with us for quite some time. And I want you to understand that though today we are talking about a PPP policy that was adopted by the cabinet of this country in 2011, the beginnings of the policy started somewhere around 2000. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because the policy in its making and adoption has transcended at least 2 administrations, and each administration was populated by people of a different political persuasion. So if you want me to talk about the policy in Parliament, then what I will say is that this policy has bipartisan support in Parliament. And when you take those 2 parties, you are accounting for probably 99% of representation of the people. And therefore, this is a policy that is dear to the heart of government and dear to the heart of the opposition in Parliament. As one of the speakers suggested, whether a government stays in power or not, this is something that as a country we have chosen to do and we will pursue it. If we will be efficient, if we will change the ways in which we do things, if we will apply ourselves to a little bit more thinking and vary our methods, etc., then we need $400 million more every year to build infrastructure assets we need to deliver the services that we desire. But if we will not be efficient, then we need all the $1.5 million, and it is something that we must be thinking about. If you cast your minds back a little bit to our recent political history, since 1983, all our political leaders have been singing one mantra, and they say the private sector is the engine of growth. We recognize the contributions that the private sector can make, and therefore we seek to partner the private sector in the development of our country. This we have heard for 31 years. For 31 years. So private sector participation is the in thing now. But if we will partner the private sector to do the things we do, by the way, we've always been working with the private sector to do the things we do. There are many ways in which we could do that. We could basically talk about what we call works and services contracts. In works and services contracts, what happens basically is the government wants to do something and finds a private party, a private sector entity to do those things. The private party entity is paid for the services they deliver to government, and they walk away. What happens is government takes over the services, be it a product or service, and then uses that to serve the population. Government will manage what ensues out of that contract, and government will be responsible for its maintenance and renewal. There is another way in which the government works with the private sector, and that is the PPP option, the reason why we are here. I'll be talking a lot more about that shortly. A third way in which the government works with the private sector to serve all of us is through privatization. I'm sure you all remember the diverse teacher program that we had in the 1990s. And I can say that probably we haven't finished completely. But privatization is also one of the options that is available to government. And you see that over this continuum, from works and services contracts to privatization, we are indeed working with the private sector to build the assets we need to provide the services we ask for and we desire. So it's just a matter of looking at the continuum in a different way. Depending on the extent of the private sector's participation, the engagement is characterized in some way. Talking to people around the country, one of the things I find is that there is great confusion between PPPs and privatization. And I hope that by the time we are out of here, the distinction would have become clear. What I can say at this point is that in a privatization situation, the private sector entity will create the assets that it needs to deliver service to the population. It delivers the service purely out of its own motives. And it owns the asset that it uses to deliver the services. I'll repeat that. In privatization, the private sector entity that enters the relationship with government owns the asset it uses to deliver service. In a PPP situation, the private sector entity again will build the asset that is required to deliver the service. But upon completion, or depending on the nature of the contract, even at the inception of construction, the asset belongs to government from the word go, and ownership of the asset is retained by the public sector. That is the difference between a PPP and privatization. It has to do with who owns what. Who owns what? To explain what a PPP means, I would like us to go back and reflect on the projects that we have always done the projects that we have always seen. Let me call that a traditional project. An example of a traditional project is the work effort that brought this hotel into existence. Another example of a traditional project is the work effort that created the Tema Port. That's a traditional project. Yet another example of a traditional project is the work effort that brought the Accra-Tema Motorway Road into existence. Why do we characterize these as traditional projects? Because that's the way we have done projects anyway. But here are the characteristics. If you have to do a project, every project has groups of activities we call project functions. So we are talking about project functions here. Now you see that these two circles, idea and procure, are in colored ash. Just to emphasize the fact that fundamentally, government is responsible for creating and delivering a vast array of services to the citizenry. If nothing at all, government is responsible for creating an environment that will make it possible for other people to provide such services to any population. So the ideation process we take for granted that it is government's responsibility. That is not to preclude the fact, the practical reality that private sector entities may also come up with development ideas and project ideas. Most of the time, governments will buy into these ideas when they fall in line with their priorities and their vision for their people. So the ideation, let's take it for granted that it is government responsibility all the time. But there comes a time that somebody must engage some other person to do something for them, and that is procurement. Then you have to think in detail what you want to do to bring about the assets you need or to provide the services you desire. Then, in the process of creating the assets, you must find money to do the work. And when the work has been done, somebody must put the assets to use. Somebody must use the assets to provide the services that you need. And then, since you use assets, there will be wear and tear. There will be changes over time, and you need to maintain the assets. Then somebody must have legal custody, ownership of the assets that are created. Now, what I want you to notice is that quite a number of these are in pink. In a traditional project, besides ideation and the procurement of a partner to do the work, government most of the time is responsible for the design, is responsible for the financing, is responsible for the operations and maintenance of the asset that is created, and also owns the asset. What most of the time goes to the private sector entity is the process that brings about the asset you use to deliver the service. So in a traditional project, what you find is that government is responsible for the entire process, so to speak, and is also responsible for the management of the process. What goes to the private sector is only construction, and when that has been done, the private sector hands over the asset to government and walks away. Thereafter, it is government, 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 government. There are variations on this, but predominantly, this is what you see when we are talking about a traditional project. So it is the kind of project in which the government comes up with an idea, finds a private sector party, does a contract with the party, and when they have finished creating the asset, government takes over the asset and uses it to deliver service to the population. What you find is that most of the time, it is a short-term contract because if you, for instance, if you construct the road from Accra to Kumasi and it takes 3 years, after 3 years, that's it. You may have a little bit of a defectability period, but that is in the details of the contract. It is still a short-term contract. You may have a contract with another organization to build this hotel, but as soon as they have finished and handed over to the management of the organization or to the owners of the organization that owns this hotel, the company walks away. If it's about building an airport, it is the same. If it's about building a seaport, the same way. If it is a school, the same way. If it is a hospital, the same way. If it's a market in some district, the same way. The PPP option is different. Because it is different, you find that the contracts we do under PPP projects are different. You find that the duration for an average PPP project is different from the duration of a traditional project. Now, because there are these critical differences between the two, you can also say that there must be significant differences in the way PPP projects are managed. And yes, there are differences. Now, I've brought the same diagram back, but now you see that a lot of the circles here are yellow. What I'm saying here is that in a PPP project, the same project functions exist. But this time, yes, the government will come up with the idea and go through processes to procure a private sector entity. And that is what we call the preparation process of a PPP project, which I'll be talking about shortly. Government will do a high-level conceptualization of what it is that they want and the services that they need. And what they do is to specify what we call the output requirements, the kind of service that must be delivered and the standards to which those services must be delivered. Now the private sector party goes about doing the detailed design, provided that design will meet the requirements of government. That is it. So first of all, you find that there's a lot of flexibility in here. The private sector party has significant control over the design that it must use to meet government's requirement. Then the private sector party will have to find the money to finance the construction. And the private sector party, most of the time, will use the asset resulting from the endeavor to deliver service. And here the critical word is on behalf of government. The private sector entity comes to deliver the service on behalf of government. And I want to say that PPPs are service-oriented. PPPs are service-oriented, which means it is the service that comes at the end that most of the time we are interested in. And it is the private sector entity that does that on behalf of government. And they will maintain the asset. But again, look at what I've done to ownership. It is still pink. And that is why I struck the critical difference between the PPP and the privatization. The ownership of the asset remains with the public sector, and that is crucial, because I've heard people say in this country that this is privatization in another form. I heard one journalist say on radio that PPP no omoboa, privatization shasiye. There is no ownership wasiye. That's what I mean. So in a PPP, the private sector, basically the public sector goes into an agreement with the private sector. But let's look at the variables here again. Because they would design and finance. Nobody's for that Christmas here. There must be an arrangement to get their money back. And because they will operate and maintain the asset, most of the time over its lifetime, it means they will be around for a very long time. So one of the critical differences is that you find that PPP projects have contracts that last a long time, and the tenure of those contracts basically match the duration or the lifespan of the asset. So if you are creating a road that is expected to last for 25 years, then the contract will be for 25 years. If you are creating an asset that is expected to last for 30 years, then you expect the contract to last for a period close to 30 years. So every PPP or most PPPs will involve long-term relationships between the public sector and the private sector. Now, you notice that a lot of these functions under PPP are now transferred to the private sector. What that means is that if there are risks inherent in this function, because the private sector entity is assuming that function, it also assumes most of the risks in that functional area. If the private sector is now taking the financing responsibility for the financing, then the associated risks largely go to the private sector. So in PPPs, one of the things you find is that the private sector bears a lot more risk than they will bear in a traditional project. And if you should look at the content of our policy, risk transfer, optimal risk transfer to the private sector, or risk sharing in an optimal way, is one of the motivations for the adoption of this policy. Now, what guarantees the quality of service for the consumer, for you and I, is that because the private sector entity brought in their money, they will watch over their investment jealously and make sure that they get their money back, plus whatever margins that would have been agreed. So the quality of service is maintained at a certain level, and in PPP arrangements, if the private sector falls below the quality standards defined by government, and when they exceed certain time thresholds, what happens is that they are penalized, and nobody wants to lose their investment because they did work shoddily. So the argument is that if we went the PPP way, we will fix the two-pronged problem that we talked about. Getting money to do the things we need to do, and getting the efficiencies that come out of the commitments that the private sector would have made with the government. So here is the difference between a traditional project and a PPP project. In the case of a traditional project, most of the time, such as the construction of a road, such as the construction of an airport, such as even the construction of a prison, or the construction of a hospital, or whatever, there is a tangible result that is created. And that tangible result is handed over to the government. And then the government uses that tangible result to provide services to the population. In the case of a PPP, again, a tangible result is created. But that tangible result is retained by the private sector entity. That private sector entity uses the result to deliver service to the population and maintains that over a long time period. So we say that traditional projects are input specified, the inputs we need to create the service. PPPs are output specified, the ultimate service that we desire. That's also a critical difference. I have talked about the fact that traditional projects happen over short-term periods. The contracts are for short-term periods. But PPP projects are for long-term, are for the long term. Again, in traditional projects, though the private sector bears some risks, it bears what I will call minimal risks. But the public sector bears most of the risks. Then the tables flip over. In PPPs, the private sector bears significant risk. And the emphasis is on the word significant, not all of the risk, but significant risk. So the challenge in structuring a PPP project is to make sure that the risks are properly allocated. That is the difference between a traditional project and a PPP project. So if we will do PPP projects, we are going to sign different contracts. We are going to allocate risks differently. And we are going to have to manage a relationship for a very long time. And these are the things we must begin to address our minds to. We don't intend to do things haphazardly. So we have started with the principles that must guide us if we will do PPPs. And that is what is encapsulated in our national PPP policy. In our national PPP policy. The policy defines clearly what a PPP is. And if you have a copy of the policy, you go to page 3, clause number 9, you will find that we define PPP in a certain way, and basically it captures the elements that I have described as the differences between traditional projects and PPP projects. But it also emphatically states that a PPP is not privatization. That is the view of our government. A PPP is not a privatization, but it's a different way of engaging with the private sector to help us do the things we want to do for ourselves. The policy also talks about the underlying principles. One of the principles is that there must be value for money. And that is why we talk about the preparation process. If the private sector did it, and it will be better, cheaper, easier, and faster for the population, then the government will go for it. But if the government has relative advantages over the private sector in providing any particular service, that is what government will do. So if we are going to do PPPs, it does not mean that we are jettisoning traditional projects, but we are going to have two parallel regimes. We may have PPP projects and we may have traditional projects. Ultimately, what we want to do is to serve ourselves better. Another principle is that we want to ensure that the private sector of Ghana is part of the process. And that is why in everything we do, we want to be working with the private sector of our country. As Magdalene said, in providing capacity to the public sector, we are also minded to attend to the needs of the private sector. Because without the private sector, we cannot do it. But because we haven't done it before, or done it sparingly, if we don't hold the hands of the private sector, we might not be able to do it. Another principle is to protect the interests of all stakeholders. And we go through stakeholder consultation processes, and we have other processes to ensure that no one is shortchanged in the process of doing PPPs. The policy okay. I understand that the policy is in your folder, so you look. Can you raise yours for them to see how it looks like, sir? Yes, that's how it looks like. It is in the folder you have. Not there? Okay, we'll get copies for you, no problem. Thank you. The policy also identifies roles and responsibilities, and these are roles of individuals, be they persons, individual persons or organizations. One organization that plays a significant role in the process is the Ministry of Finance, specifically the Public Investments Division. The Public Investment Division has gatekeeping roles, it has advisory roles, and the strategic projects of this country are also managed from the Public Investment Division of the Ministry of Finance. The National Development Planning Commission also plays a significant role. They are the creators and managers of the National Infrastructure Plan. You may have heard about it before. Eventually, it will be published and we will all know what it is. But they are the creators and managers. And all ministries, all departments and agencies have roles to play in this thing we are talking about. If there will be a contract with the private sector, be they local or foreign or in partnership, that contract will be between an MDA representing government and that private sector entity. Under the policy, such an MDA or public sector entity is called a contracting authority. This is something you'll be hearing very often, a contracting authority. So if AMA must go into an agreement of some sort to build a park of some sort or a facility of some sort, then AMA becomes a contracting authority. Government as government does not exist, but government is always represented through some kind of entity. And it also outlines the process of going through a PPP project, the process of doing a PPP project. And I'll take you briefly through the process. The process basically goes in 5 stages, and therefore there are 5 approval points in the process. Each of the approval points, the approval is given at each of those gates by a certain approving authority. Now, the authority depends on the approval levels, or in terms of the quantum of money that may be required to do the project. So at the district assembly level, there is a threshold. At the metropolitan assembly level, there is another threshold. At the municipal assembly level, there is a threshold, and you can see this on page 18 of the policy. At the national level, there is also a threshold. These thresholds, as I have talked about, are determined by the quantity of money required to do the projects. And under our constitution, some kinds of projects must always go to Parliament. Those projects will also go to Parliament after Cabinet has seen them. So we have different approval authorities. But we also have what we call the PPP Approval Committee. It may look at almost all projects. So the process is very simple. What you do is, when you have come up with an idea and you want to pursue it as a PPP project, what you do is to register the idea with the Ministry of Finance, with the Public Investment Division. And when you bring the idea, what we do is to register it by giving you a number, but we would also ask you a few questions. Are you prepared to do this? Do you have the capacity to do it? Do you have the financial wherewithal to do it? Have you appointed people who will be in charge of the process? If any of those answers is no, we will not stall the process. But what we will do will be to work with you to ensure that each of the answers has become a yes. And then we ask you to go and do a pre-feasibility study. What that means is go back and check again. This time, we expect you to come, telling us that you are truly convinced that probably if we pursued the idea as a PPP, it will be worthwhile, having in view the requirements of our policy and subsequently hereafter the law. If you come back and tell us that you are convinced, we expect that you would have come with the concurrence of your ministry. And then at the Ministry of Finance, as I've indicated, we would work with you. So if that is the case, we ask you to go and now do a full feasibility. And if again, a PPP project is indicated, then we present it before the PPP Approval Committee, depending on the level. And again, this time we are going with you and your minister and other people from the Public Investment Division of Ministry of Finance to defend the project before the Approval Committee. And if we are able to convince them and we address their concerns, then we move on to prepare procurement documents. We will prepare the documents so that we could procure the services or the partnership of a private sector entity. So the procurement documents, again, will be prepared by you, the contracting authority. Let's remember that the PPP projects will remain our babies and not the baby of the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of Finance will forever play a hand-holding role just to be sure that we are doing the right things. So the project will be yours, and fundamentally you have responsibility for the projects you do. So you prepare the procurement documents, and then you come back to the Ministry of Finance, and all we will do is to work with you to ensure that the documents have been done right, and in the process, the interests of all stakeholders have been addressed. That is the reason why we would have to look at these procurement documents. And when we agree that the procurement documents are okay, then we would ask you to go and do your solicitation. During this time, you would now advertise, etc., receive proposals, etc. And what you'll be doing then is to review the proposals and come up with recommendations regarding who you think will be the best party to partner with to deliver the services we desire to the population. And again, if we should agree with you, and again, if we don't agree, we would work with you to reach agreement. The intent at the Ministry of Finance would never be to stall the process. It would be, on every occasion, to make sure that we are doing the right things for our country, for ourselves, and for our tomorrow. So when we procure the party, we will start negotiations. But before we come into any form of agreement that must be signed, we will present it before Parliament and Cabinet, if necessary. Cabinet and Parliament, that's the sequence, if necessary. And again, let's understand that this process of project preparation, depending on the size of the project, depending on the nature or the sector of the project, depending on the level of complexity of the project, and the stakeholders involved, could take, let's say, 6 months. Sometimes it could take 1 year, 2 years. At other times, it may even take 3 or 4 years. And here again, whenever I mention 2, 3, 4 years, then in our minds, oh no, the time is too long. It is not long. We can debate this forever, but I keep saying that it is not long. I'll give you a few examples. We have always been dreaming about dualizing the Accra-Kumasi road. And it started in the days of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. We have always been dreaming about the Buankra Inland Port, which originally started at Fumesua. And it started when I was a sophomore in the university. We are still thinking about doing it 28 years on. The point I'm making is that we have spent 28 years on a project and nobody has complained because nobody said they were preparing it. We got the idea and we were looking for partners. We never found them because everybody who had an interest came and found that we were not prepared and walked away. The point I'm making is that if we don't prepare our projects well, we will not find the partners. Some studies have shown that there's a lot of money to be invested in Africa because of our underdevelopment and because of the opportunities here. Do you know that the highest returns on most investments can be found in Africa? On most investments anywhere on earth. Yet they still come and they don't invest their monies in our economies simply because the projects are not well prepared and therefore not attractive. The argument is, if we can prepare our projects well, then we would attract the investment that we need. And I will be in the position to select because there will be competition for what we have. If we don't prepare our projects, it will take us 28 years and Buankra Inland Port will not be realized. It will take us the life of a country from independence to date, and the Accra-Kumasi Road project is not done because we have not dualized it. It will take us probably a century more to do other things that we wish we did today. We must prepare our projects. Now, because it takes, let's say 6 months to, on the average, about 4 years, before we sign the contract, we may have to go back to the basics. If the feasibility study indicated that it is commercially viable, it is financially viable, it has all the viabilities that we can talk about, we would necessarily have to go and check again because the basis of the conclusions we came to may have changed. And that's the point we're making here. So before we sign the contract with the private party, which marks the end of the process of project preparation, Cabinet will ask us to go back to look at the basis of the statements we have made. Parliament will ask us to go back to look at the basis of the statements we have made. And if we are still convinced, we will go back to government. Sometimes, if we become unconvinced in the process, government may decide that because this is a priority project, that because this serves the ends and purposes of Ghanaians, we will still do it by supporting it somewhat. So what you find in the process is that government is setting up some funds to support the PPP process. Now, when you're going through this process, we say you are preparing the project. You are preparing the project. And most of the time, you may have to get the services of a consulting firm to help you, particularly if you have not done it before. And I can say that for most of us, we have not done these things before. So you find that we are procuring a lot of transaction advisory services These are the people helping us to prepare our projects so we can set them before cabinet and parliament. You would also have to do that in these early stages. But fundamentally, the purpose of Ghana PPP project is to develop and entrench a culture of PPP procurements, so that when this project is over by the end of 2016, you will be that confident to do that PPP project that will bring that kind of service to that man in that part of this country. And your experience will become a learning point for other people to also become champions of PPP projects in their MDAs. If we have not achieved that by the end of 2016, we would have failed. But as I stand here, I make you one promise, that I'm not here to fail. Magdalene is not desirous of failure. And my colleagues at the PPP Secretariat, at the PID, in the Ministry of Finance, do not wish to fail. However, we need your cooperation. We need your assistance. Just imagine that one day, as one of the speakers suggested, you sit in your car and you want to travel from here to Tema. On your right are 8 lanes, and those coming are also traveling on 8 lanes. And then in your dreams, upon your bed, you ask, who are the people traveling on those roads? And they say, they are the children of Ghanaians. Wouldn't it not be nice? Just imagine a situation where you have a health challenge, and you just pick the phone, and there is an ambulance at your doorstep. They put you in there, and they give you initial care and take you to the experts, and your life is saved. There is no traffic to stop you on the way. Would that not be a desirable situation? Just imagine a situation where the dollars you have earned in this country are applied to educate your child in this country, and that wealth stays in this country, and it becomes part of our common heritage. Would life not be better in this place? Surely it will be. Just imagine that you want to travel to Kumasi at any time of the day, and you can go because the runway has been made longer. We have built new terminals. There are lights on the runway, and now you can travel anytime you choose. Would it not be better? Are we not going to be more efficient in the process? We can talk about the Takoradi Road project. We can talk about expanding Tema Port. We can say the same thing about Takoradi Port. We are talking about the Atuabo plant. Now gas is coming from only one oil field. Just imagine a situation where we have several oil fields all providing gas. Then you can buy gas at a cheaper rate. Anytime you need gas, you can get it. Imagine a situation where we would not have any more Dumso. Will it not be better? Ladies and gentlemen, what we all seek is a better Ghana. A better Ghana in which we partner with the private sector of our country and the rest of the world. We hold hands and move together in the right direction. This is what we are talking about. This is what a PPP is. This is what a PPP can do for us. Let's continue talking about PPPs. Let's continue learning about PPPs. And let's continue solving the problems that confront us through PPPs and through traditional projects. And that better Ghana will be here for all of us. And together, we will move in the same direction. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mike Awuah.